Hello, plant lovers. It is Matthew in Melbourne, welcoming you back to my channel. Thank you very much for finding me. And if you're new here, I grow cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia, without a greenhouse or grow lights or humidifiers, just me and them inside or outside or not at all. So plant lovers, if that sounds like your kind of conditions, do hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday my very amateur ramblings about the things I've learned that work for me here in my climate, which aren't the right way or the only way or the best way, but they do work for me and they might work for you if you have similar conditions. So hit subscribe and join me on my amateur journey. Which brings us quite cunningly to this beauty. Look at this. So this is an amateur ramble that has actually paid off. Isn't that the prettiest flower? And without any further ado, we must jump in and tell you what it is, which is Symphyglossum sanguineum. Curious, sanguineum as a suffix in botany means blood-like or blood, So I'm a little perplexed. So generally what that means is that in botany that a plant might have a red stem or red seed pods or red sap or just a red flower. This, plant lovers, is pink, but maybe the seed pods are bright red. I don't know. Maybe there's a variety that was originally found in the wild that was red. Although this is a species orchid, which means this is how the plant occurs in the wild, and it's pink, so no redness. Anyway, not quite sure where the sanguineum comes from, but maybe the seed pods are red. Maybe that's the thing. I don't know. Geography lesson I'm showing you on the map now. This beauty comes from northwest Peru and Ecuador, so that high mountainous area, which I think I can fairly say most of the orchids from that similar type of climatic area, so particularly from the Andes, those high altitude orchid plants, they just do really well in Melbourne, which is not high altitude or Andean, but bright, moist, cool winters. Anyway, so whenever I see that as an origin for a species type of orchid, I always think, aha, I have to have it. It's going to do well. And then it might promptly die. But as a beginning point, it's kind of useful. Similarly, for orchids that grow in that Himalayan region of India, Nepal, Bhutan, across into China, Laos, Vietnam, those sort of northern parts of Vietnam and Laos, those high altitude plants from that neck of the woods also do really well for me here. And that can include coleogenes and cymbidiums, for example. And the other things that do well from this sort of region for me are Masdevallia and Miltoniopsis. So there you go. If you're in a similar region to me and you can grow those other types of orchids, you'll be able to grow this. So as with many an orchid, it's an epiphyte. So it's in those beautiful, moist, damp forests. And this one is obviously more of an understory plant. It likes to be on the lower side of the light threshold. Now, mine is on the second shelf of a bench outside, and it gets quite good morning light, actually a little bit of direct morning light in both winter and summer. And then it gets indirect bright-ish light, but not bright. It's on the second shelf. So there are other plants above it, and there's a lot sort of going on. It's a bit further back. So it's a bit more sheltered and protected from direct light. But I think when you see that a plant likes lowish light, I think it's a good idea to bear in mind that obviously light's going to move in these forests, and in the morning the light is often lower. You might get more penetration, but also these high altitude plants are kind of in clouds too often, so the light is generally diffused. So it might not be about direct light, but about diffused light. So mountainous orchids often are in essentially full sun, but because they're always in cloud cover, it's constantly diffused. Anyway, depends on the orchid, depends where it's from. Ultimately though, this doesn't want really harsh bright light. And now let's just look at the flower. Look at that, these beautiful, beautiful sort of hooded pink blooms. Aren't they stunning? Now, as you can see, that's quite a long flower spike, and we've got buds sort of evenly spaced all the way along. They're opening sequentially. Very, very beautiful. And in terms of its sort of flowering habit, as you can see, the plant itself looks not dissimilar to an Oncidium. So we've got a large pseudobulb, and we've got leaves at the side, and we've got leaves coming out of the top of the pseudobulb, and the flower spike has come out of that junction of the leaf and the pseudobulb. So just like an Oncidium would bloom. And like Oncidium growth, as you can see, this flower spike is growing out of the last year's or the last year's growth mature bulb. And then I have new growths towards the back, which like Oncidiums will mature and then hopefully produce blooms. So like many an orchid, the name of the game, plant lovers, is obviously vegetative growth. The more growths you have, the more bulbs will mature, the more chance you get for flowers. The other curious thing though is, as you can perhaps see here at the back, kind of getting almost a little bit of a climbing habit like a maxillaria. So we'll see how that pans out. This was a seedling when I got it. I've had it for a couple of years. So it's had a good sort of 16 to 18 months of growing, and it's become quite vigorous, as you can see, and then flowered for me, which I'm thrilled about. So back in its mountainous forest, let me lift it up so you can see the gorgeous flower. Back in the mountains of Peru and Ecuador, it is an epiphyte, like many an orchid. The area where it comes from doesn't really have a dry season, so this is one of those plants that you do not want to let dry out. So that means in winter, I am still giving it a little bit of top watering. Obviously, you really dial down the watering because you don't want it to be cold and wet in winter, but you don't want it to dry out. So a good idea for watering in winter is when it's as bright as possible and breezy as possible so that the plant will dry out within those daylight hours. Now mine is outside all year. As I said, it's on the second shelf of my growing bench. So it's undercover, protected from the rain. But other than that, it's taking the cool nighttime winter minimums. And so here in Melbourne, as I said, those sort of mountainous plants seem to do well as long as you can protect them so you can manage the watering yourself. Our nighttime winter minimums don't really get close-ish even to freezing here in the inner city of Melbourne. We sort of have that urban heat blanket over the city that keeps it quite warm. The further out you get, obviously, the cooler the nighttime winter minimums can get, and it regularly gets below 0 or below 32 degrees Fahrenheit the further outside you get. And in certain outlying parts of Melbourne, there can be frost. But here in central Melbourne, there isn't frost, and we rarely get below sort of 3 or 4 degrees centigrade at night in winter, which is the sort of the high 30s, low 40s Fahrenheit. Cold, but not freezing. And this baby is obviously loving it. So the flowers are stunning and not a skerrick of fragrance. So this one is obviously all about the flower shape and the color to attract its pollinators, not fragrance. But still, I am not worried at all. The flower looks familiar to me somehow. It's reminded me of something, and I can't quite think what it is. Anyway, beautiful, beautiful, pretty flower. And I have seen images on the great God Google of bigger plants covered, well, not covered, but 3 or 4 different spikes. So you can imagine how wonderful that's going to look with multiple spikes. So that is my aim, which is growth and blooms. Now, promoting growth means good basic care and conditions. So as you can see, this is in a medium bark mix. Now, it's an epiphyte. It's kind of very similar. It's very closely related to Oncidiums and very similar. So I would use whatever Oncidium mix you are using. So for me, that is medium to small bark with perlite, with charcoal, with sphagnum moss in a sort of a fluffy mix. And I've made a video about what do I pot my orchid in, which I'll link above and below. Essentially a free draining mix that you'd use for many things. You'd use it for Miltoniopsis, Oncidiums, many things that have similar growth habits. And then, as you can see, it is in a terracotta pot because I am, plant lovers, a terracotta pot kind of guy. Although I must say, I have recently been drilling my own orchid holes. I'll drop in some footage right now. It was all, well, many of you have said, Matthew, drill your own orchid pots, and I did it. I got myself some diamond drill bits and I started to drill my pots. It's wet and messy, but very satisfying and a great way to produce exactly the size of orchid pot that you want. So I will be doing that more and more. But anyway, this one is in terracotta. Now, The disadvantage of terracotta is you can break it, but also it does evaporate faster than plastic. So where this is in summer, the ambient temperature can get quite high. So it's quite drying, which means you do have to water things, keep your eye on things. So plants that don't like to dry out, if it's really warm, I might have to water every day. So that is a negative with terracotta because it is going to dry out really quickly. And so some of these more delicate things, I have Masdevallia in terracotta, I just have to keep my eye on them. The plus though, is kind of the same thing. It evaporates and drains quickly and freely. So great for epiphytes. It means that the medium doesn't stay sort of wet and soggy for too long, and your plant's roots aren't going to stay soggy. So that is a great bonus. It just means in summer, it's a negative as well. So as I said, this is a species orchid, which means it's as it's found in the wild. And I got this from a company called Orchid Species Plus. And if you live in Australia, these guys often exhibit in orchid fairs, and they actually have a really great eBay site as well. Very reliable, great people to buy from. I bought this one on eBay from them, and I bought it because I'm always Googling an orchid name. And if I see that it's a cool cold grower, I immediately order it regardless, which has led me to kill a few things, but this one is so right for my conditions. So I'm really, really thrilled. You don't often see it, so I'm very happy that I've got it. Anyway, I'll link those guys below. And if you are in Australia, you can certainly have a look at what they've got. They obviously do sell things that aren't cold and cool. They do sell warm, hot, and intermediate orchids as well. So if species orchids are your bag, check those guys out. So fertilizing wise, not dissimilar to many other things, really. Obviously, in winter, again, I don't really fertilize much unless the plants are inside and they're actually going through a growth cycle. But all the outside orchids, and this one is outside all year, I don't fertilize during winter. But once the weather starts to warm up, in spring, I give a little topical application of a slow release fertilizer pellet, which is also in the mix when I repot anything. That's a 6-month release. So from spring, it will sort of be releasing its goodness until autumn, which is great. So if you're using slow release fertilizer, just make sure it says 6 months, not 12 on the packet, because you can get 12-month release, slow release. And then in summer, well, the warmer months, from spring, summer, autumn, depends how cold or cool autumn gets. Every sort of second or third watering, I do use a liquid-based orchid food. So whether it's an orchid-specific fertilizer or an all-purpose fertilizer, or it's a tonic, such as a seaweed-based solution, or worm juice, which my lovely neighbors give me, I dilute all of those down to sort of 1/8, 1/10 the recommendation, and every 2 or 3 waterings, I will give it one of those types of treats, as I would do all my other orchids. Now, the only thing that's sort of bothering me a little bit are I've just got a few little brown tips. This is a new growth with a brown tip. Now, as this plant's on the second shelf, and there's a brown tip there, few things. My orchids that are outside can get munched by munching things. So generally caterpillars and little slugs. I just found a slug munching the roots of a seedling I just bought. And I also this morning just found a caterpillar happily sitting on the flower of an epidendrum of mine in bloom, munching away at the flower. Now, we all love butterflies and moths, but I do not want their caterpillars eating my orchids. Anyway, so that is something for me and you to always keep your eye on. So sometimes the little leaf damage on my orchids is from the baby hatchling caterpillars who just sort of eat the underside and leave translucent little trails, and they move off to better pastures. I think they don't love orchids that much. So I do have quite a few plants with that kind of caterpillar damage. This, though, I wonder, it may just have got splashed on. It may have been wet inappropriately when it was sort of cool and windy. I don't know what's been going on with that. Anyway, I need to keep my eye on it because I don't want anything happening to that new growth. But generally, the plant's looking really healthy. The new soda bulbs are really sort of shiny and fat and hydrated, which is great. So we're hopefully on for a great blooming season next year. And talking of blooming seasons, it is now late summer. I'm filming this in February here in Australia, which is the last month of summer. Although we just had an Arctic blast, my goodness, it's been so cold for the last 3 or 4 days, literally winter conditions. And for an orchid grower, perhaps like you, that makes me so anxious because I have things outside that are only outside in the warmer months. They can't take winter minimums. So when we have this weird, unseasonable weather, I do stay up at night. It was worrying. Anyway, do or die, you've got to survive or not, I guess. Anyway, this is a cool grower, so there's no issue there. But it is supposed to flower from autumn through to spring, and the flower spike started to emerge in early summer, so not quite sure what's going on here, but who cares? It's flowering. So there we are, plant lovers. Such a beautiful flower. And I must say, this has been quite easy. It's just been sitting on its shelf, doing its own thing. Fairly similar conditions, I think, perhaps if you grow oncidiums, cooler oncidiums, that you can grow outside all year if your climate can support that. So I've got some oncidiums that are outside all year as well. So not dissimilar conditions, maybe just a little bit shadier. But if you can grow Masdevallia, Coleogenes, Symphydiums, then you can grow this. So see if you can find it. Not that common though, I must say. So I was very fortunate to find it from Orchid Species Plus. But if you can get a hold of it and you can grow those other things, if you can grow Miltoniopsis, for example, these are all cooler loving plants. This one, though, can take the warmer summer temperatures, but it does need that cooler winter to thrive and bloom. So plant lovers, thank you very much for watching. As I said, I do post every week on a Friday, so do hit subscribe if you want to watch my continuing amateur adventure as I find my way through the rocky paths of growing orchids here in Melbourne. I hope wherever you are, all is well, that your orchids are blooming, thriving and loving life and living their best lives. So until next week, I look forward to seeing you then. See you later.